So my name is Oliver Fredrichs. I'm with Symantec, and today I'm going to talk about threats to the presidential election. And this, I have to admit, this is a tough area to actually research and to talk about, because you can clearly go off track and you can start spreading misinformation and spreading FUD, which is not exactly what we want to do here. That being said, it's a very interesting area to apply all of the historical security knowledge that we've acquired over the last several decades to one particular area. So at Symantec, I oversee a team called Symantec Advanced Threat Research, which is focused entirely on researching new threats. Windows Vista is one of the areas that we've looked heavily into, and some of you may have seen some of our research in the past, which we've spoken about at previous Black Hats. And today I'm going to focus on the election itself. And a lot of the content that you see here is actually going to be available in an upcoming book by Symantec Press called Crimeware. And that's not necessarily a plug for the book, but Addison Wesley has graciously allowed me to present all of the material here at no cost, so that you don't actually have to go and buy the book unless you want to read all of the other chapters. So when we look at the election, we really have to set the stage. We can see that it's impossible to predict the future, but what we can do is we can speculate, we can make educated guesses, and we can also learn from past experiences. Again, we can apply all of the knowledge that we've acquired over the last several decades and apply it to this one particular area. A lot of what we'll discuss has actually been seen before in other security contexts. So this is really applying a lot of what we've seen to the election itself, but also we've also found a few unique new areas that we can talk about that are likely to manifest themselves only in the event of an election or even some other type of charity process. Now, this is some FUD here. Clearly, it doesn't look very attractive, so I don't intend to attempt to spread a lot of it today. And really, a lot of what we're going to talk about has really been set into context according to our rating system that I've tried to apply to all of the different threats. Now, you may not actually agree with my rating system. I'm pretty close to this research area, so clearly, I may have a different view. So I just want to ask you to judge for yourself, based on what I'm going to talk about, whether or not you agree that these are significant threats. This is really the rating system that we're going to apply. There's three main areas. Elevated, which means that there's no immediate detrimental impact, but the threat can be used as a stepping stone or a beachhead to launch a further, more serious attack. Secondly, level 3 is high, which is a more serious threat, something that can actually cause midterm harm. It can cause confusion, and campaigns and voters should take immediate action to try to prevent these particular types of threats. And then finally, 4, which is extreme. This is a very high severity threat. It has the potential to severely disrupt a campaign and to potentially cause widespread confusion and actually potentially impact the outcome of an election. And the important thing to remember here is that while I'm focusing on the 2008 election, the research can really be applied in any electoral system, really any, even potentially towards charities and online donation sites. So let's kind of set the stage here and take a look at where we are today. The internet is increasingly being used for and relied on by campaigns to communicate with their constituents. It's clearly been used in the 2004 election, but when we look at the 2008 election to date, it has overshadowed it by far. Every single campaign is online today. Every single campaign is using email. They have websites, they have blogs, they have news, a variety of different vehicles that they use to communicate with you. So it's really important to understand the risks. We can apply many of the areas that we've seen in the past to the electoral system: adware, spyware, dissemination of misinformation, invasion of privacy. And I'll get into a little more detail of these as we go along. And again, the emphasis for us is on the 2008 election. And a lot of the past research has been focused on voting systems, on the security of voting systems and the voting process. Our goal here is to focus exclusively on internet-borne threats, which, to the best of my knowledge, people really haven't looked at in a lot of depth before. So when we look at the election process, and we look at the amount of money being used and raised online, it really started in 2004. That was the first time that widespread email was used in order to communicate with constituents. The Kerry campaign was clearly in the lead, raising $82 million online throughout the 2004 election. Howard Dean was in second at $20 million, and George Bush was in third at $14 million. This is not pocket change. It's a lot of money. So clearly, some campaigns needed to raise more online. The Bush campaign, for instance, already had a lot of money, so they didn't necessarily need to use the internet as much. Now, we also see that email and other forms of communication are viral in nature. 45% of Democrat donors, for example, received an email almost every single day. And 70% of online donors forwarded emails to each other. So this means, again, that emails in general related to campaigns are generally fairly viral in nature and can potentially be fairly widespread. When we look at 2008, the contributions have already overshadowed the 2004 campaign. Obama, for example, raised $28 million online in just January alone. That is a lot of money, and that's 88% of all of the money that he raised in that month was raised online. When we look at Hillary Clinton, another good example, she raised $8 million online in Q3 of 2007, which again is a lot of money at the time to raise online. So we clearly see a lot of money exchanging hands online through the campaign donation websites. So I'm going to start talking about some of the specific areas that we consider threats. And one of them, the first one is actually that we've looked at fairly deeply, is typo squatting. So typo squatting is where someone registers a domain name that is a mistake or a spelling mistake of a real domain name of a campaign website. So for example, if I try to go to hillaryclinton.com, but someone registers Hillary Clinton with a J in front of it instead and calls it Jillary Clinton, because the J key is right beside the H key, that's a typo. And we see that many of these typos are being registered online for many other purposes, but they're also being registered for the campaigns themselves. So when we look back historically, many of these typo domains and domain name speculation has really been running rampant for the last 20 years or so. In the early 90s, people started speculating on internet domain names. There really wasn't a way to deal with this until 1999 when ICANN introduced the UDRP, the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Policy. And this allowed legitimate trademark owners or common law trademark owners to actually get your domain name back. So if someone stole it, you could get it back using the WIPO process, the World Intellectual Property Organization, which actually implemented this policy to launch a dispute and get your domain name back from the infringing person who's registered that domain. So it really provides a framework for it, but the interesting thing is it doesn't prevent you from registering these domains. I can go and register 1 million typo domains. WIPO won't stop me. It really doesn't help. It helps after the fact when you actually realize that someone has registered these typo domains. Another thing that came into law is the ACPA, the Anti-Cyber Squatting Consumer Protection Act. This is actually a legal remedy that lets you get your domain names back. And the difference here is that it actually provides a way to recover monetary damages rather than the UDRP, which only provides ownership of the domain to come back to you. Needless to say, both of these laws and measures have only had marginal success. There are millions of typo domains registered online today, many of them by advertisers because they're able to drive traffic to banner ads and to other advertising sites, and they're making a lot of money. Everyone wants to be this guy. Kevin Ham has amassed a fortune of $300 million just building a portfolio of typo domains and speculating on domain names. That is a lot of money. And he's one of the first guys to be doing this, so clearly he has the first mover advantage. But that being said, there are a lot of people who are trying to be him today, and they're infringing on a lot of trademarks that nobody really knows about. So here's a good example of a case that went to WIPO. Julia Roberts, she went to WIPO. Someone had registered, that's kind of hard to read. His name was Russell Boyd, had registered juliaroberts.com, probably sometime in the 90s. She went to the board to recover her domain name. They ruled in her favor because it was clearly her domain. They decided to give her ownership back of the domain. And you can see she's pretty happy about that. She finally got her domain name back. Sting, on the other hand, not so lucky. Sting.com, you can imagine, is a fairly generic domain name. So when Sting tried to go to WIPO and get his domain name back, they said no. And you can clearly see he's still playing his guitar, and he doesn't look that happy. So you can see that there's clearly a vehicle to recover domain names when you actually discover that they're being infringed on. So we decided to do a little exercise, and we decided to find out, okay, how big of a problem is this related to the actual electoral system and the 2008 campaign? So what we did is we identified all of the 19 candidates who had registered with the Federal Election Commission back in March and identified all of their domain names. So we identified 19 candidates, we identified their primary campaign websites, and we removed anyone that was not on a .com simply because we had access to the .com, some of the .com data files, which allowed us to do this research much easier. And the other domains were .us. We didn't have access to those. So that was left us with about 17 candidates. Obviously, all of the primary candidates and the leading candidates are all in the .com top-level domain. And these are really their sites. So you can see JoeBiden.com, HillaryClinton.com. All of the common sites that you would normally expect are there, and it allows you to relatively easily see all of their sites. So what we decided to do is to do a test, and we implemented a fairly simple process to identify typo domains and cousin domains. So cousin domains are different than typo domains. They generally include the entire domain name within a subset of the domain. So for example, voteforhillaryclinton.com is an example of a cousin domain, but there could be millions of those, and you're not likely to enter those by accident. So we really weren't interested in those, at least not in this presentation. That being said, typo domains are domains where you are likely to make a mistake when you type them in, and you're likely to see visitors coming to these typo domains on a frequent basis. So we created two simple applications. TypoGen is one that generates typos based on an input domain name, and TypoLookup does a DNS lookup and a whois lookup to see if these domain names are actually registered and who owns them. So when we generate typos, we really look at 5 common techniques. And there's more ways you can do this. These are the 5 that we used. We remove the dot between the www and the domain name. We moved characters one at a time. So instead of Mitt Romney with 2 T's, you have Mitt Romney with 1 T. We hit surrounding characters. So when you look at your keyboard, there are at least 5 characters around a given key. So you can easily mistype and hit one of those keys by accident. So in this case, Mitt Romney, we replaced the T with an R, and so in this case it's Mitt Romney with 2 R's in it. The 4th technique, we added an additional character, so if you hit a character twice, you're able to make a typo. And then 5th, we actually reverse 2 characters, so instead of Mitt Romney, you go to Imt Romney, or some other variation of that. So what this allowed us to do is to basically generate all of the potential typos for a given domain name. And you can clearly see the results that we see here. These are the actual results of the number of typo domains that are registered by others other than the campaign itself. So if we look at Barack Obama, he's in the lead if we look at our numbers from August. So we can see that 33% of the possible typos for his domain name are registered, and they're registered by people other than Barack Obama. So clearly someone is registering these domain names, and it's not the campaign themselves. So that tells us 2 things. One is someone's registering them. Secondly, the campaigns themselves haven't really taken a proactive step to protect themselves from this problem. So we have to wonder, who is registering these and why are they registering them, and why don't the campaigns know about this? And you can see the numbers decrease, and largely it's driven by popularity. We can see that the more popular candidates are, they're likely to have a higher tendency to have more typo squatters sitting on their domain names. And also a lot of stuff that drives this is that there's something called tasting, where someone can register 1 million domain names with a registrar. They have 5 days to test them, and within 5 days, if they want to return them, they can return them for free. They don't have to pay for them. So during that 5-day period, they can measure the amount of traffic that they get to those domain names and just keep the ones that are actually useful. So this is very, very common, and ICANN is actually trying to introduce steps to prevent this in the future by actually introducing a small fee for the registration of domains, even if you don't keep them. Fast forward to February, when we actually reran our statistics here. We can see the candidates in the red here have all dropped out of the race. In some cases, though, they've actually moved up in typo frequency. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama have swapped places in terms of the most prevalent typo squatters or typo squatted candidate. We can see Hillary Clinton has 41% of her domains typo squatted right now. We can see Barack Obama has actually dropped to 29%. John Edwards, who's now out of the campaign, is about 25%, so he's actually up 5%. But it's interesting to see, how much and how much change we see, because these domain names expire, people may not re-register them, they may be testing them, so there's a variety of things that are kind of moving targets here, so it's always hard to measure this constantly. A couple other things that we can see is we can see that some candidates who have dropped out continue to allow donations on their websites. So there's at least 4 candidates here who still allow donations, and they're out of the race. There's nothing that says, we no longer accept donations. There's not even a message that says, thank you. We're trying to raise money to recover our debt, for example. You can still make a donation, and it's not clear where that money necessarily goes. 2 other candidates allow donations, but they clearly say, thank you for your support. We're doing this simply to recover the debt that we've incurred as a result of our campaign. A number of other candidates here, their websites have been abandoned. They're just gone. They don't even exist anymore. So it's not really clear, what they're thinking, where these websites went. And we can see some good examples here of these sites. In this case, Joe Biden's website, has somewhat been abandoned. The submission and donation page is there, but it doesn't work. It says the merchant count is expired. So nobody's really bothered to clean this up. It could be a little confusing. If you're hiding under a rock, for example, and you still want to contribute, you wouldn't be able to. A couple other examples. These websites have either been disabled by the hosting company, or they don't even have a website on them anymore. So it's not clear, exactly what their campaign has done with the site. You just kind of get an error message. So thanks a lot for the support. We're packing up and we're leaving. So here are some examples of registered typo sites. The first one here, BarackObamas.com, is a typo site that some advertising typo squatter owns. You can clearly see that he set up a site which looks similar to Barack Obama's site. Actually, not really, but it's intended to promote him. But really on the right, what you see is an advertisement for Barack Obama's real campaign. Now, this is interesting because what happens here is that a typo squatter owns this typo domain. You're visiting it. Barack Obama's campaign is paying Google to show these ads to actually direct you back to his real site. So it's a double whammy. The typo squatter is making money, and Barack Obama's campaign is paying the typo squatter because the typo squatter owns their typo of his real campaign website. So interesting. Here's another example, HillaryKlingon.com, which makes her look like a Klingon. And you can see in this case, Klingon is a mistype of Clinton because the G key is right below the T key, right? So it's easy to make that mistake. And if you go to this site, this is what you'll see. So it's not only sites that are trying to profit from this, but sites that are clearly either making a mockery or detracting from a candidate. Another example, Rudy Giuliani, his site was the JoinRudy2008.com was overtaken by a typo squatter who registered 20,008.com. In this case, another site that actually detracts from him claims that he's profiting from the September 11th attacks and et cetera, et cetera. So interesting, we see a lot of this kind of stuff that you may see if you mistype a candidate's domain name. MittRomney.com, if you mistype that and type in Mutt Romney, you'll find out that Mitt Romney admits to killing small animals as a child, and other interesting things like this. HillaryClinton.com, which is one that I mentioned. This is interesting because it's also an advertising site, but the first thing you see on this site is actually an ad for Barack Obama's website, right? So it's another interesting. It's interesting to look at how ad syndication works. In that, is Barack Obama's site actually registering AdWords for Hillary Clinton? And that's almost what it looks like, but it's not really clear. So this is something that is likely to become more and more common, and we're likely to see this type of thing play out over the next, this election and potentially future elections as well. Okay, so we saw all of these people registering typos. I was jealous. I needed some typos myself. I had to buy some. All of these people were making $300 million. I just had to get in on this. So what I did is I registered 124 typo domains for a handful of top candidates. $800 at GoDaddy gave me 124 domain names for some of the top candidates for the 2008 presidential election. So I own the typo domains for these candidates. And I picked them, really, I didn't put a lot of thought into it. I just picked a handful of top candidates, and Mitt Romney was one of them, Barack Obama was one of them. Hillary Clinton. So you can see there's a breakdown there of the typo domains I registered. Now the interesting thing is, anyone can do this. It cost me $800. The campaigns can do it to protect themselves, but really nobody's done it. So I'm actually giving these domains to the campaigns because my intent here was not to profit from them, but to actually help protect them, and that's really the ultimate goal. So the interesting thing is I've owned these domains since July of '07. Not one person has contacted me to ask me, why, Oliver, do you own these domains? What are you doing with these domain names? One reason might be that they're registered under my name. And in fact, I've clearly said that they're registered to prevent typo squatting. And it has my semantic email address so people can see, okay, well, maybe they're registered by semantic to protect the candidates. And that's really what we did intend to do. And then that's really what we have done. But that being said, not one person has really asked, why have you registered these websites? So somewhat surprising. Clearly, if someone in China registered these websites, someone may have noticed and actually gotten more concerned. So these domains sat idle for about 6 months, and they sat around, and I really didn't do anything with them. So I thought, well, I have these domains. I really should do something interesting with them, something that's not going to, cause any damage or any potential, liability. So what I did is I set up a server that would forward all of these domains to my server, running Apache, running virtual domains, and it would actually redirect the domain back to the legitimate candidate's website. So if you went to the campaign or the typo domain, you would go to the real website. So really, no harm done. You were going to the website. The interesting thing was that I was able to look at who was visiting my typo domains. So I was able to gather statistics on who was actually making these typos because they were going through my server and I was redirecting them back to the legitimate campaign's website. So I used a great tool and I'd highly recommend it. I actually just found this the other week called Weblog Expert, which has a 30-day trial. And I don't work for them clearly, but I'm so impressed with it, you'll see some of the charts. To analyze these logs, I filtered out crawlers, spiders, bots, anything else that was suspicious that likely wasn't a human. And that gave me data from about 3 weeks, from January 25th through to February 15th. And that included Super Tuesday, interestingly enough. So I got a limited amount of data. Clearly 6 months would have been more interesting. But it allowed me to take a pretty good look at what was actually being sent to these typo domains. In total, I got 4,600 hits across the 124 domain names. I saw 3,290 unique visitors that made typos and came to my typo domains. And that's not a huge number, but considering that it's still 3,000 people that intended to go to a presidential candidate's website and went to mine instead by accident, it's still a pretty interesting number. I could do a lot of things with those people if they come to my website. Traffic is really negligible. Because I was only serving redirects, it was about a meg of traffic over that whole period. Not particularly interesting. So let's look at the actual metrics from this. So I saw about 300 visitors a day, around 400 hits coming to these typo domains. You can clearly see the spike during Super Tuesday when people were more likely to actually go to these typo domains because they were typing them in directly into the browser address bar and visiting these typo domains. If I look at the most frequently mistyped site, Barack Obama is number 1, 411 hits, 304 visitors, and you can see that he clearly outpaces mittromney.com. And you can see the top typos are either duplicate characters. In this case, Barack Obama has 2 A's in it. It's not clear if someone is just mistyping that or doesn't know how to spell it. We'll never really know. Mitt Romney, someone misses the M. Again, because the M key is right beside the N key, it's relatively easy to miss that key when you're entering it. So, interesting. These are interesting statistics. We're able to see why, potentially why people are making typos and what type of typos they're inclined to make. Okay, where are these typos coming from? The U.S. is number 1. Clearly, it's the U.S. election. That's where most of the typos are coming from. You can see that the other countries, Canada, United Arab Emirates, interesting. What is that? In honesty, these numbers are so small, they're probably statistically irrelevant. But I had to look into it and find out, why are these hits coming from the United Arab Emirates? So I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides. But you can see, this is what we would expect. Clearly the U.S. during Super Tuesday, huge spike. Right? This is where people are going. and they're coming to my websites, and which I'm redirecting to the real campaign, but I don't have to do that. California is the top state. San Diego is the top city of where these clicks are coming from. IE7 is the most frequently used browser, but IE6 is not far behind. Interesting. We can see that a lot of people are still running IE6. What does that mean from a security standpoint? At least the people clicking on my typo domains are. It's tough to say whether that's accurately transposed across the entire population. They may just not be as smart. That's why they're making typos. And they also don't update their software. So why is this important? Well, browser plugin vulnerabilities are a huge problem. We continue to see more and more of them. In the first half of 2007, we saw 237 browser plugin vulnerabilities. So, I could easily, if these people come to my website, try to exploit them, try to exploit a plugin within their browser, 89% of which are ActiveX controls. And Windows XP is the most common, with Mac OS X, second. Interesting as well. Again, these numbers are not that great, but it still gives us a really good breakdown of operating system usage across the people making typos to our sites. Okay, so put your conspiracy theory hats on for a second. Why is United Arab Emirates third on our list of people visiting our site based on country? It's the single top IP ranked by visitors. So we saw 41 hits from this IP located in United Arab Emirates. It's actually, the address space is owned by Emirates Telecommunications Corporation, interesting as well. Now, we see 41 hits to one particular domain, and that's it from that IP address. It was all BarackObama.com over a 15-day period. Why was this happening? Well, we actually looked at the log files, the raw logs, to find out what's happening here. How come we see these hits? What can we find out about this? So we can see that every single hit here is actually coming from a browser that says SimBar enabled in it. And it's not really clear at first what this was, so I had to do a little bit of Googling to find out what this actually meant. What I found is that this is a piece of adware. It's a marketing application that is installed potentially maliciously, potentially you opt in when you download it with something else. It doesn't seem that common. I wasn't able to find a whole lot on it, to tell you the truth. So the question is it driving traffic to our website as a result of potentially someone just misspelling an advertisement link and inserting two O's instead of the A in Barack Obama, or the K and the O? So interesting. Likely a typo. I guess we can take our conspiracy theory hats off. It doesn't look like this is anything to be worried about. Again, it's something that is odd, but it's probably not what we thought it was. Now, this is scary. Email squatting. So we've talked about typo squatting for websites. Now, what about typo squatting for email? This is scary, and it gets scarier, and I'll give some good examples of this. And I told you I wouldn't spread FUD, and I'm not. But this is concerning to me because it's a serious problem, and I don't know if people really think about it. So what is email squatting? Email squatting is setting an MX record for your mail on a typo domain to go to your mail server instead of the candidate's mail server, or any company's web server, for example. So typo domains just got a lot more important because not only can you redirect web traffic, you can redirect email. So if I enter an incorrect email address in my email client, I could get your email that you had intend to send to the recipient if you mistype their domain name. So clearly we have autofill and built-in auto-completion in email clients, which reduces the risk. But if it's the first time you've sent mail to someone, you can potentially make a mistake, and you can see what that person intended to send to the legitimate recipient. So we decided to do a very, very strictly controlled experiment. This was somewhat horrifying to us in general. We didn't want to be accused of doing this. But I did want to find out, can this happen? To what extent is this possible? So our requirements were really that we could not intercept anyone's email. We could not invade anyone's privacy, including email headers, really everything. We did not even want to see emails coming to these candidates. We did not want to have the liability of exposing private communications, even receiving them, even storing them. And we didn't want to disrupt email service. So if you actually tried to send an email to someone, we didn't want to be responsible for it disappearing. So what we did is very simple. We created MX records for all 124 of these candidate domains. We set up a Linux box with IP tables to block port 25. And this box was the only box that it would receive email only for these domains, right? So someone hitting port 25 would potentially, more than likely, be someone trying to send email to one of these candidate websites. And we looked at the results for 24 hours. We didn't want to do it very long. And what would happen is if you tried to send a mail to this domain, it would get connection refused over and over again, and it would just bounce back. So you'd find out that you made a misspelling, and you'd be able to send it to the real Hillary Clinton website, for example, or wherever you're trying to send it. So what did we see? We saw 1,121 total connection attempts during that 24-hour period. These are 1,100 attempts from likely someone trying to send email to the campaign's domain name. We saw 12 distinct IP addresses who tried to send email that the email attempt came from. So we know that at least 12 emails likely tried to get sent to these domain names. And we saw about 7 distinct top-level domains, everything from Yahoo, Google, Hotmail, that all tried to, their mail servers tried to connect to us to try to send us email. So interesting, because if we were the bad guy, we could have installed SMTP Sync, which is free, and actually collected all of this email and seen what was in there. Or we could have redirected it to the real recipient, rewritten the to address, and nobody would ever have known that we're actually doing this. This is why this is so scary. What would we have seen? Well, probably spam, probably voters asking for information. We may have seen organizational emails within the campaign itself, potentially strategy, speeches. Who really knows? It's really open to anyone's guess what we would have seen if we actually collected the email. Now, interestingly, we decided that this is a serious problem. Where else could this be happening? So we did a little bit of digging around and kind of picked a couple of potential defense contractors randomly. And what we did is we generated all of the typos for these defense contractors. We did whois lookups on these typo domains, and we did MX lookups to see if there were MX records for these typo domains. This is, I would say, one of the scariest things that I'm going to talk about. We found one defense contractor whose one of their typo domains is registered in India. There is no website up for this domain, but there's also no MX record. So someone's sitting on it, but it's not clear what's happening with it. They may just own it because they may want to, in the future, generate advertising revenue from this typo squatted domain. But the second case is concerning. This is a typo domain of a contractor that has no website on the typo domain, but it has an MX record pointing to China. Interesting. Who is sitting on that typo domain collecting emails for this well-known company in China? So it'd be interesting to look to see how widespread this stuff is actually happening. This is one domain for the entire potential, probably 200 typo domains. So it's not clear, this could potentially be an accident, or someone could actually be sitting on this domain, legitimately, but we don't really know. What we do know is that there's no website, there is an MX record, and if someone did make a spelling mistake, they would get their email. So that's enough to at least believe there may be something happening here. Okay, so that's really typo squatting. Clearly there are some serious ramifications of it. It's not been taken as seriously as we would expect. I would say that if you have a domain name today, register your typos. Don't walk, run, and register your typos. It costs you like $800, right? It's so cheap, and it will save you so much trouble in the future. So phishing. Phishing is something that continues to be an ongoing problem in the financial sector and charity sites and other areas as well. So we see event-oriented phishing pretty frequently. We see phishing around numerous events worldwide, around the Indian Ocean tsunami, for example. we saw a lot of phishing sites in 2004 as a result of that. Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and the FIFA World Cup in both 06 and even for 010 coming up, there's already some phishing around that. So clearly phishers are active. They generate on average well over 1,000 phishing sites per day, campaigns per day. So it's a lot of this is happening. Brazil even sees shorter-term phishing, for like rock concerts and other short-term events. So event-based phishing is not new, and the election is clearly a fairly long event. So one thing that I did back in August is I actually registered for typos for every single candidate, all 17 candidates that I was tracking. I received roughly around 941 email messages over that 6-month period. So that was a lot of mail. Candidates are clearly using mail pretty heavily. So I filtered this and put it into a mailbox. And I took a look at it statistically. I saw about 167 distinct email addresses. So normally you may expect one address per campaign. Well, no, they have to use 5 or 10 each. So we have 167 unique email addresses coming from campaigns, which may make things more confusing if I'm trying to authenticate based on the source of the email, which you shouldn't be doing anyways, but for the average person, it's still something they may do. So what did I see? I saw clearly John Edwards, I know that's probably impossible to read, was in the lead, sending me 116 emails over that period. I saw Joe Biden 105 emails, and I saw Huckabee 102 emails, and it goes down from there. So clearly email is used heavily. It's used heavily to solicit donations and to give status updates, to send links out for videos, and really everything that's required in order to communicate with constituents. So the first thing I mentioned, inconsistent sources. This we would call a fairly low severity threat. Right? You shouldn't be authenticating based on the source address of email anyways, but consumers really don't know. Right? So you want to be consistent. You want to use one email address that someone recognizes. Yeah, it can be spoofed easily, but it's still something that makes sense. You don't want to add to the confusion. So in this case, John McCain email came from McCain08hq.com, which I've never seen before. I don't know what that domain is. It hasn't even showed up anywhere on my radar previously. So I only got this one email from that domain, and it's not clear if they just decided not to use it again or if it was a mistake. Hillary Clinton, I got a swath of different emails from a variety of different people. A lot of people I think like to put their name, their personal name in the email, maybe to get some recognition. So there's a lot of different people either from the campaign here that are listed, and clearly it may help them get more support because they may have their own set of supporters here in this case. So again, a variety of different emails. Hillary Clinton herself seems to have 3 different emails in this particular case. Again, interesting. She's obviously not the one sending these emails, but we see a variety of different emails that are being used. Okay, so when we look at email and sending of email, one thing that's become more and more common is something called sender ID or SPF version 1. This is a email authentication mechanism that's not cryptographically secure, but it's better than nothing. What it does is that when your mail server connects to another mail server and you send the hello command or the mail from command, it looks at the domain name that you're trying to represent, and it does a TXT record lookup to the domain name, and that TXT record contains really a rudimentary access control list that says which IP addresses are actually allowed to send email for that domain and where they're allowed to send it from. So this is something that's gained adoption. It's great that campaigns are using it. They should. ISPs should be using it. Everyone should be using it. But it's not used internet-wide, at least not yet. We do see that most of the top campaigns are using it. So we can see Barack Obama is using it, Hillary Clinton, Mike Huckabee, John Edwards, John McCain. They've all implemented it. You can see an example here of Hillary Clinton's record, which says that all of these addresses are allowed to send email to, or rather representing the hillaryclinton.com domain name. We can also do some limited information gathering. I can tell that she uses MX Logic and Postini, both anti-malware and hosted anti-spam companies. So that's a valid looking SPF record. Basically everything prior to the minus all is included, and then everything else is not included. So nobody else can send email as hillaryclinton.com unless you also forge DNS, which is possible, but it's much harder than just typing in telnet port 25 and spoofing your email. Now, the second case is actually Tommy2008.com, which is a bad SPF record. This is not what you want to do. So you may as well not have SPF. You're actually allowing every single IP address on the internet to send email as you. This is not what you want to do. So in this case, again, it's a low severity risk because not everyone's using it. In some cases, they're misconfigured, but it's still no less secure than anything else we have on the internet today. Another thing that we took a look at is actual donation links. So every candidate has a donation page. Every candidate has a link to go to a donation website. Now, many of these pages are actually hosted by third-party advocacy companies that are not actually on the campaign website or are actually processing the transaction for the campaign itself. So in this case, we can see every single candidate uses SSL. They, in many cases, use third parties, but in many cases, they're actually using their traditional domain name, but in some cases, they're actually redirecting to a completely different domain name unrelated to the campaign, again, which is confusing. You don't really need to do that. If you use DNS correctly, it's not necessary. You can simply redirect to another IP address using the same top-level domain, but a different host name, right? And in this case, they haven't done that. Sample donation website. Very, very simple. One page, you hit submit, and your transaction's processed, right? So it's very simple. You don't have to do anything. There's no CAPTCHA, there's no registration, there's no sign up. It makes it very, very easy for campaigns to raise money, but it also makes it easy for phishers if they want to set up a fictitious website to impersonate this site. So phishing is something that there's clearly a moderate severity risk, level 3 in this case, high. We've seen it during the 2004 election. It targeted the Kerry Edwards campaign, which again was recognized as one of the leading campaigns that leveraged the internet during that election cycle. And there were really two types of phishing. One was traditional phishing website that tried to get your credit card number and information. And then there was a second attack which tried to get you to call a 1-900 number and charge you $1.99 a minute. Only two attacks throughout all of the 2004 election. To date, the 2008 election has been very, very slow. We haven't seen a lot of phishing at all. And in fact, I'm not aware of one particular attack to date, although I could be mistaken. I really haven't looked at every single phishing attack, but I don't recall us seeing one over the last year for the federal election. We do see 1,000 phishing campaigns per day on average, though, which is a large number. And these campaigns are against financial institutions, government sites, really a variety of different places. And there's absolutely no reason to believe that phishers won't target the election, especially when they know how much money is being raised online. So clearly, we're getting into the later days of the primaries, and more and more candidates have dropped out, so the targets are becoming less and less significant. But again, this can be applied to any election, not only the 2008 election. Now, this is an interesting attack. This is a new attack that we were able to kind of invent based on the simplicity by which you can make a donation. So what this attack involves is actually diverting contributions intended for one candidate to another candidate. So what we do in this case is, there are many different ways that we can drive someone to a phishing site or to a fictitious website. It could be through phishing, emails rather. It could be through typo squatting, or it could be through malware, right? So if I'm able to direct you to my fictitious website, I can do this. I can cause you to go to my fictitious website, like BarackObama.com with 2 A's. I can set up a Barack Obama website, capture your information, and do a one simple post to John McCain's website and actually submit that information. Very, very easy. There's nothing that really prevents this. Again, we haven't seen it. Some of this, again, is speculative, and we certainly recommend that campaigns in the future take measures to actually make this more difficult, but it's basic, simple web technology. Something like this, it doesn't sound very sophisticated, but it can still have both a monetary and psychological impact on voters, simply because they're now contributing to the opponent of a particular campaign. And right now, there's no login required for online donations. There's no CAPTCHA, really no interaction beyond filling in the information and posting it. Most of them are single-page submission forms, and a lot of them provide instant credit card transaction or confirmation. So this leads to another new attack, the contribution denial of service. And we've actually seen this in the past, which I'll talk about in a minute, but this is where attackers or thieves make very small transactions to a candidate's website. They could be anywhere from $5 to $10. We've seen it already in 2007 against Ron Paul, and we've seen it against charity websites in the past. So clearly this is something that identity thieves are leveraging on a regular basis. They're making these small transactions. They want to know if their credit cards are valid and if they can use them for the purchase of other goods. So all contributions are not helpful. They can be disruptive. They can, for example, an attacker could submit random small contributions to a number of different websites. They can use thousands of credit cards. And for a campaign to try to filter all of this, well, it's not easy, right? If you have thousands of transactions coming from potentially a botnet that's submitting all of these, well, it's kind of hard to filter out what's legitimate and what's not. And we've seen it. We saw it against the Ron Paul campaign, a relatively small attack, only about $3,000 worth due to the theft of credit cards from Frost Bank. 500 stolen credit cards were used, around $5 to $10 contributions. So we saw a fairly small version of this attack, and it was easily found, easily refunded. Clearly, if the attack's coming from one single IP address, it's easy to track, and you can refund the money and identify the attack. But again, if it's over a botnet, it's much harder to do this. Okay, so we talk a little bit about malicious code and how it applies here, since it's certainly an area that also has the potential to play into this. And in some of these areas, this is where we get increasingly more speculative, because this is a lot of things that we haven't seen. So we kind of have to take some of this with a grain of salt and not take it too religiously. And again, this is where you may not agree with my conclusion as to how severe this threat is. So I would urge you to make your own decision here. First is adware. So in its most dire form, adware is clearly not something that we would consider important throughout the election process itself. That being said, adware installed on a computer still makes it less secure. Someone else is able to update adware in many cases, display banner ads. So for example, we can envision adware that replaces ads for one candidate with another candidate and pops those ads over one candidate's website. They could be very innocuous. They could actually inject the ads right into the HTML within the browser itself, or use the graphics calls to actually overlay advertisements over the browser itself. And these are techniques frequently used before. This is not new. It's been used by Hotbar, Gator, and When You Save, all in the past. So again, it's not a stretch to believe that this could be applied here as well. Spyware. This is another new area, where we believe that it could be applied to the election process and the electoral system. Now, when we look at how statistics are gathered historically, the Gallup poll is one of the vehicles that we all really recognize as a means to collect widespread disposition information on how voters are likely to vote throughout the election itself. They're well known. Most people who contribute here are willing. They're willingly contributing. This is different than spyware. Spyware has the potential to actually monitor your behavior, monitor your actions online without your consent. So in this case, it's relatively easy, for example, for a rogue spyware applications to gather some fairly widespread statistics on your propensity for a particular candidate, or the likelihood of you, for example, donating to a candidate, or donations that you've actually made. So in this case, we see that this has the potential to play in, certainly if people do want to collect widespread data on the emerging election itself and to determine how voters are trending. Now, one thing's clear, you could have a well-written EULA that talks about stealing your information, and most people are not going to read it. When you, for example, had a EULA that was 45 pages long, nobody read it, right? It pretty much pointed out what it could steal, but nobody read it, right? Nobody cares. You're just going to say, yes, I want my peer-to-peer application, and you get spyware with it, so I'm going to be happy. And again, I'm just mentioning them as one example here, which has been clearly documented over and over again on the internet. So again, the potential for spyware to play a role here is there. Whether or not it will, again, we really can't say, but it can. More interesting is, even without spyware, I can determine which websites you visited. Now, this is interesting. I also think this is not very widely known. It's actually a subtle feature of Internet Explorer and other browsers and cascading style sheets. This is discovered, I think, by several different people. I know Stanford University has done some research on this. Indiana University has also done some research on this. What this allows you to do is essentially use this feature of browsers to determine what websites you've visited in the past. I can examine your history when you come to my website. So if you came to my 124 typo domains that I talked about earlier, I could get a full list of websites that you visited before, if I have a fixed list of those sites. Excuse me. So how does this work? There's a good write-up actually at indiana.edu's website which talks specifically about this. But in short, there is a cascading style sheet pseudo class called visited. So when you visit a website, you notice that the link in your browser changes color, right? It's a different color after you visited than before you visited it. So you can take advantage of cascading style sheets to actually send a web request to a server identifying which links that you visited in the past. Here's how you do it, and it's really this simple. So you have one example here where if you had gone to, for example, Barack Obama's website in the past, your browser would send a request to my website when you visited my website telling me that you've gone to his website. It's a few lines of HTML. And it's a very subtle nuance of how cascading style sheets work. So let me actually give an example, because I went to Indiana University's website earlier today, and I've been doing a lot of research on candidates. So I bank with Union Bank. I went to Amazon sometime in the last few weeks. This is what it was able to tell me. Their website was able to tell me that I went to Union Bank, that I bank at Union Bank, that I went to Amazon.com, and that I visited every single one of these candidates' websites over the last week. Every website on the internet can learn this about you, right? And to date, there's really been no fix. So it's interesting. It's really a data leakage bug within browsers that shouldn't really be there, because it's certainly disclosing or has the potential to disclose private information. Okay. Oops. All right. Malicious code. So we've talked about some of the more subtle threats. Malicious code is another threat clearly that has the potential to play into the outcome of an election. A widespread malware attack, for example, can certainly play into here, but a targeted, well-placed attack can also play a role here. A widespread attack can certainly cause confusion, right? If the attack is very sophisticated, it can redirect your traffic. If you're trying to go to one candidate's website, it can take you to another. It can just, like we talked about earlier, it can replace banner advertisements and other advertisements. So really, there's a lot of different things that malicious code here can do, not least of which is steal your information. So it can steal all of your data. It can learn who you're supporting, where you're making donations, and it can do all kinds of interesting things with all of that data. Now, more interestingly, in a targeted attack, against a campaign staff member, for example, a candidate themselves or a member of the candidate's family, a well-placed keylogger would be even more concerning, if you can envision the type of information that can be stolen as a result of that. So website accesses, whose website they're going to, draft speeches, strategy around their campaign, etc. Now here's one threat called FlexiSpy, which is something that's available today. You can buy it. It can infect anyone's cell phone that you have physical access to. The interesting thing is that when you buy this software sold by a company in Bangkok, Thailand, and you install it on someone's cell phone, you can actually record all of their communications, even when they're not on the phone. It turns on the microphone on your smartphone, and it basically sends all of the voice data up to their website, where you can review it later, and you can listen to their communications and their discussions, even when you're not on the phone. So very, very interesting. These types of threats, again, are not new. They've been around for a while. But if they're infecting campaigns or candidates, we can see what can happen. So if you consider, for example, a few years ago, Arnold Schwarzenegger's website mistakenly had recordings of him within a private meeting with his staff, which really ultimately made the press, because these recordings were not supposed to be on the internet. They were leaked, and someone found them and discovered and found that he had made some comments that he shouldn't have. Can you imagine what would happen if you were able to get recordings of a candidate and their private conversations on another candidate or opponent? So clearly, there's a lot that can happen here. And again, we don't want to blow this out of proportion. This is all stuff that already exists today. So it's really a matter of will we see this in the process of an election? Ransomware. This is again an area where we see somewhat of a new twist. Right? This is where we get even more speculative. Is if an application, and we've seen these in the past, is able to get onto your computer, encrypt all of your data, and ask you to vote for a particular candidate, or you don't get your data back. So again, we are getting speculative, but we've seen this type of stuff in the past, for money. So will we see it for your vote? Also, if you have data that you shouldn't have, pictures, copywritten information, other personal information, and the attacker finds it, can they, threaten to expose you unless you vote a certain way? So clearly there are logistical problems with all of this, right? It may seem a little far-fetched. How does the attacker actually know that I voted a certain way? But we've seen Trojans like this before. GP Coder was one. It encrypted files with certain extensions on your hard drive, and it required that you mail or create a PayPal payment to a certain account, or to a Yahoo email address rather, in order to get your data back. Now, malicious code lays spam. We've seen this in the past. On Tuesday, February 2nd, actually just the other week, we saw this against the Hillary Clinton campaign. Very, very rudimentary email, right? Most of us are smart enough not to click on that. We realize it's spam. I mean, you couldn't have gotten more basic. But the reality is that, this was a link that redirected through Google and took you to another site that downloaded a Trojan. And this Trojan would infect you. It would install a rootkit. It would hide registry keys, configuration files, network connections, and other settings when you tried to look for the rootkit itself. And the interesting thing is this particular attack was really there to drive a spam campaign, right? So it would turn the infected system into a zombie, which maybe actually tried then to further propagate these election-based, Trojan-laced emails. So interesting to see that attackers are starting to leverage the campaign to do this type of stuff, and we're likely to see it more so in the future. Now, where did this point to? The Russian business network. Not surprising. We all know who these guys are. They've been around for quite some time now. The IP address where this malware was downloaded from was registered to RBN. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about a somewhat new area. Again, when we look at the physical election process, there are all kinds of misinformation campaigns, deception campaigns that happen fairly regularly that we see pretty frequently in the past. So we've talked about typo domains, phishing, spam. These are all lures that may cause you to come to a website, right? So if that website has misinformation or intimidating information or deceptive information, clearly that website could potentially have some impact on you. It's not clear how widespread that impact could be, or whether it would actually sway a vote or the general populace. But all three of these can clearly be used to spread misinformation. right? Misinformation could include the decision of a candidate to drop out of a race, a fake scandal, legal or health issue, other subtle information like the change in someone's position on a given topic, and even push polling, right? We've all seen examples of push polling in the past using traditional mail. I don't think we've really seen it widespread on the internet yet. So these are all things to look forward to. Again, they're things that we haven't quite seen yet, but they're likely to happen simply because they happen in real life. They're going to happen on the internet. Campaign website security clearly plays into this. Server vulnerability, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, IT outsourcing, outsourcing your campaign to a third-party advocacy firm. These are things that we see pretty regularly. And email policies and standards, like I talked about earlier, the emails that we saw from the various campaigns, could be construed as confusing simply because they're not consistent. So, cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. This is one example that we have already seen. At the end of January, we saw one instance of Mitt Romney's website, which actually did have a cross-site scripting vulnerability. So if I sent you a link, it would look like it took you to Mitt Romney's website, but in reality, the JavaScript, when it was run, it could redirect you to another website. It could create a pop-up or post fake, misleading information to you when you visited that website. So there's a variety of things that cross-site scripting can play here. Clearly cross-site scripting is not a serious threat. We rate it as a fairly low level 2, in this case elevated threat, according to our grading system. But it's still something that we have already seen, and it's likely to cause more of a problem in the future if it's not cleaned up. Deception and intimidation. So we've seen many, many cases of this in the past using traditional forms of communication. We've seen it in 2006. For example, in Orange County, 14,000 Latino voters received communications telling them that it's illegal for immigrants to vote and that you'll be incarcerated if you vote and deported, right? That's intimidating to say the least. So clearly a lot of these types of things are targeted towards minorities, and we've seen this type of attack targeted against others as well, including students in the past. We saw a similar situation in 2004 in Pittsburgh, where college students were petitioned to sign petitions around medical marijuana and auto insurance, but in reality what they were signing was a change of party affiliation form and a change of polling location form. Interesting. So they were actually signing away and changing their party affiliation and their polling location as a result of this. So one thing that's being introduced, and I honestly don't know where this sits right now. I know it's passed through the Senate. I don't know if it's actually entered into law as a result or not, but there's a new bill called the Deceptive Practices and Voter Intimidation Prevention Act of 2007 that was spearheaded in part by Barack Obama to actually prevent these types of things from being perpetrated and to make it a prosecutable offense with fines of up to $250,000 for anyone who violates this type of act. Now, we all know that policy is important, but we have to look at spam as an example of that. Today on the internet, over 50% of all email is still spam. We don't see it, it's filtered out, but there is a lot of it. So we've seen pump and dump scams being very, very successful, actually being perpetrated by botnets, which include the widespread use of emails and sending of emails. In 2006, one botnet was responsible for a pump and dump scam that used 70,000 computers in 166 countries to elevate a particular stock. And really this type of attack can be directed using any type of email. You can really send anything in this type of an attack, including misinformation. Election spam, we've seen this before as well. In fact, back in October we saw this. Around 120,000 messages is what we saw within our own spam traps, targeting the Ron Paul campaign and actually trying to support his campaign. So election-based spam is something that we certainly see as a possibility. Now, this last area is somewhat interesting. It's a little different than what I've talked about before. The Federal Election Commission is an organization that was created to track campaign contributions. And this was really created to be able to provide accountability on who was donating what and to who, and to provide this as public record. So it was created in 1975, it exists today, and it enforces all of the campaign donation laws. Now, the requirements around reporting is that any donation over $200 needs to be reported to the FEC. And so campaign websites clearly articulate this when you actually make a donation, and as a result, this data is publicly available. You can actually FTP this data from ftp.fec.gov, and you can see a full database of all donations made historically for every single federal election over $200. Very interesting. This includes zip code, this includes your city, this includes your employer, and of course it includes your name. So I did a little experiment. I was looking for someone who was at the conference here, donation, and I tried to pick on a speaker. So the person I picked on was Dave Eitel, because he graciously agreed to let me use him as an example. And you can see here that Dave Eitel can easily be found on the New York Times website, who has this database, and he made a $1,500 donation to Barack Obama in this case. So it's interesting. It's information gathering. I can, for example, use this as part of a spear phishing attack. If I want to target this individual, I can now send him emails asking for more money, if I'm a phisher, for example, or other types of electronic attacks. It's certainly not hard to find his email address at this point and to send him email directly. So it's interesting to see all of this data available. It's obviously required, but what are the implications of a database like this being available through FTP? So, in conclusion, I think some of the things we've talked about today are real threats. They're already happening. They have the potential to cause serious problems, not only for the election, but for other areas, including the defense contractors that I mentioned earlier. Who is likely to launch these attacks? Well, we certainly believe that the campaigns, or hope that the campaigns themselves, are not likely to participate in a lot of these attacks. Maybe some of the more subtle, less serious ones they are, but some of the more serious ones we certainly believe they're smart enough not to do this. So it would be someone who's either a staunch supporter for a candidate, a little more extremist, and who's willing to go the length to actually launch this type of attack, but potentially even a foreign state or government who may be interested in doing this. The attacks themselves have the implication, if we were to see them all, clearly of sowing some fear across online donations and making it very difficult for the general populace to trust or believe in the donation system itself. They can be combined, so none of these can really stand alone. You can combine them to make increasingly more sophisticated attacks, and the attacks themselves cross not only technical, monetary, but also psychological boundaries, because they're affecting your right to vote, and they may affect the information that you see as a result. So clearly campaigns need to do some things to protect themselves. They're in general reasonably secure. I would say that they're no worse off than a lot of other organizations around the world, but there are clearly some things that can be done to more proactively protect themselves. So that is really it. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Yeah. That's a good question, and I was asking that myself actually pretty frequently. The only thing I can think of is, one, people are terrified of interfering with an election, especially the presidential election, and the implications or repercussions would be much greater as a result. Or they've just got it too good where they already are and they don't really need to go here, right? So it's not, obviously there are really two motivations for these types of attacks. The first is monetary, the second is politically motivated. All right, well, thank you very much.